The moment I realized my son no longer considered me family came on a Thanksgiving morning that should have felt warm and familiar. I remember staring at my phone and thinking that surely I had missed a message. Surely there had been a call. Surely my son had not forgotten about me. I checked again. Nothing. The turkey was already in the oven. The dining table was set for 4 even though only 1 chair would be used. Old habits are difficult to break. For years, I kept preparing for family gatherings as though things might suddenly return to the way they once were. Outside my kitchen window, the last leaves of autumn drifted across the yard. Inside, the silence felt heavier than ever. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 72 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that no matter what happened, family would find its way back to family. That belief had carried me through difficult years. It had carried me through the loss of my husband. It had carried me through lonely birthdays and quiet Christmas mornings. But on that Thanksgiving, something inside me began to change. Around noon, I opened social media and immediately wished I had not. There was my son Michael smiling beside his wife Sarah. There were Sarah's parents standing proudly beside them. There were my grandchildren laughing around a beautifully decorated dining table. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked together. I stared at the photograph longer than I should have. Then I noticed something that hurt more than the picture itself. Michael had written a caption thanking Sarah's family for making every holiday feel like home. Home. I read the word 3 times. I had spent decades creating a home for that boy. I had worked extra shifts when money was tight. I had driven him to baseball practice before sunrise. I had stayed awake through fevers, disappointments, and heartbreaks. Yet somehow, I was no longer part of the place he called home. I placed my phone face down on the counter and walked away. The turkey continued cooking. The clock continued ticking. The world continued moving as though nothing had happened. Later that afternoon, Michael finally texted. The message was short. Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. Hope you are having a nice day. No invitation. No apology. No explanation. Just a few words sent between family photographs and holiday celebrations happening somewhere else. I typed several responses before deleting all of them. In the end, I wrote only 2 words. You too. That evening, I sat alone at the dining table. The food had grown cold. Across from me sat an empty chair that once belonged to my husband. For a long time, I stared at it. Then I found myself asking a question I had avoided for years. When had Michael started choosing them over me? And perhaps even more troubling, why had I spent so much time pretending not to notice? At that moment, I had no idea that a single careless remark a few weeks later would uncover a family secret that would change everything I thought I knew about my son, my family, and my own past. For years, I convinced myself that distance was simply part of adulthood. Every time Michael missed a birthday, I found an excuse for him. Every time he canceled dinner plans at the last minute, I told myself he was overwhelmed with work. Every time he spent another holiday with Sarah's family, I reminded myself that young families have complicated schedules. The truth was that I became very skilled at protecting my own heart from disappointment. Looking back now, I can see how often I chose hope over reality. A week after Thanksgiving, I stopped by a local grocery store and unexpectedly ran into one of Michael's former baseball coaches. We stood near the produce section talking about old times. He asked about Michael. He asked about the grandchildren. Then he smiled and said, "You must be excited to spend Christmas with them." I smiled back and said something polite. After all, what else could I say? The truth was that I had not been invited. As I drove home that afternoon, I realized how many people still assumed my son and I were close. From the outside, everything probably looked normal. Michael called occasionally. He sent birthday cards. He visited once or twice a year. Yet genuine closeness is not measured by calendars or greeting cards. It is measured by presence. And his presence had slowly disappeared from my life. December arrived with cold winds and early sunsets. One evening, I sat in my living room wrapping gifts for my grandchildren. The television played softly in the background while snow drifted past the windows. I carefully folded colorful paper around toy boxes and children's books. As I worked, I found myself remembering a much younger Michael. A little boy racing down the stairs on Christmas morning. A teenager pretending not to be excited about presents while secretly checking every package under the tree. Those memories felt so vivid that they almost seemed recent. Then my phone buzzed. For a brief moment, I felt a spark of excitement. Perhaps it was Michael. Perhaps he wanted to make plans. Instead, It was a group message containing photographs from a holiday gathering at Sarah's parents' house. Michael stood beside a beautifully decorated fireplace. The grandchildren sat on their grandfather's lap. Everyone looked comfortable. Everyone looked connected. I studied the photographs for several minutes before setting my phone aside. What hurt was not that they were happy. I wanted them to be happy. What hurt was realizing that they had built an entire family tradition that no longer included me. A few days later, Michael finally called. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. He sounded distracted. He mentioned work. He mentioned holiday shopping. Then he said he needed to go. After the call ended, I remained seated in silence. The room suddenly felt larger than usual. Empty somehow. That was when a difficult thought entered my mind. Maybe this was not temporary. Maybe this was not a busy season of life. Maybe my son had chosen a different center for his world years ago, and I had simply refused to see it. At the time, I still believed that was the hardest truth I would have to face. I was wrong. The remark that changed everything happened 2 weeks before Christmas. At the time, it seemed so small that I almost missed it. Sarah's parents were hosting a community fundraiser at their church, and despite feeling somewhat out of place, I decided to attend. I told myself it would be good to get out of the house. Good to see familiar faces. Good to stop dwelling on things I could not change. The fellowship hall was crowded with people carrying paper plates and cups of coffee. Christmas decorations covered every table. Children ran between rows of folding chairs while holiday music played softly in the background. I spent most of the evening standing near the dessert table speaking with neighbors I had known for years. Then, while reaching for a napkin, I overheard Sarah's mother speaking to another woman nearby. I was not trying to listen. In fact, I doubt she even realized I was close enough to hear. She laughed lightly and said, "Well, after everything Eleanor did back then, I am surprised Michael still talks to her at all." My hand froze in midair. The conversation continued, but I heard almost nothing after that sentence. Everything Eleanor did back then. The words echoed in my mind. Back then when? What exactly had I done? I stood there for several seconds, staring at the tablecloth while my heart pounded. Eventually, I forced myself to smile and continue through the evening as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. A question had been planted in my mind, and once it was there, I could not ignore it. On the drive home, I replayed the remark over and over. Sarah's mother had spoken with complete confidence, as though referring to a story everyone already knew. Yet I had no idea what she meant. I considered calling Michael immediately. I considered asking Sarah directly. Instead, I remained silent. Experience had taught me that people often reveal more when they believe you are not paying attention. The following morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. I began thinking about the years after my husband passed away. Michael had been in college then. Life had been difficult. Money had been tight. We had disagreed occasionally, like most parents and children do. But nothing happened that would explain the distance between us today. Nothing that would justify the quiet resentment I sometimes saw in his eyes. The more I thought about it, the stranger it became. Later that afternoon, I opened an old closet in the guest bedroom. Inside were boxes I had not touched in years. Family photographs, letters, school records, documents from another chapter of my life. I pulled one box onto the floor and removed the lid. A thin layer of dust drifted into the air. Inside were memories I had almost forgotten. As I sorted through the contents, I had the unmistakable feeling that I was standing at the edge of something important. I still did not know what secret everyone seemed to believe about me. But for the first time, I was determined to find out. For the next several days, the box remained on my dining room table. Every morning, I told myself I would spend only a few minutes looking through it. Every afternoon, I realized hours had passed. Inside were pieces of a life that felt both familiar and strangely distant. Old report cards, holiday cards, medical records, photographs from family vacations. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed something that made me stop. Several letters were missing. Not physically missing from the box itself. Missing from the story the box was telling. I remembered keeping a collection of letters from the years after my husband died. I had written some. Michael had written others. Yet entire stretches of time seemed absent. The gap bothered me. One snowy afternoon, I carried another storage container down from the attic. It had not been opened in years. Dust covered the lid. The cardboard felt soft with age. I placed it on the floor beside the Christmas tree and slowly sorted through the contents. Near the bottom, beneath old tax records and household documents, I found a small wooden keepsake box. My breath caught. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my husband. After his passing, I stored it away because opening it felt too painful. I had not touched it since. Carefully, I lifted the lid. Inside were several photographs, a few handwritten notes, and a bundle of envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The envelopes were addressed to me. Most were from relatives. Some were from friends. Then I noticed one written in Michael's handwriting. I stared at it for several seconds before opening it. The letter was dated more than 20 years earlier, during his first year of college. As I read, confusion washed over me. Michael thanked me for helping him through a difficult time. He wrote about how much he appreciated my support after his father's death. The words were warm, loving, nothing like the distance that existed between us now. I reached for another letter. Then another. The same pattern appeared. Affection, gratitude, trust. I sat back in my chair and stared at the stack. If Michael once felt this way, what had changed? The answer could not simply be adulthood. People grow apart, but they do not usually rewrite their entire understanding of a parent. As evening approached, I continued searching. Tucked inside one envelope was a folded document I had never seen before. It was not a letter. It was a photocopy of a legal statement connected to my husband's estate. Several lines had been highlighted. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Then I saw a handwritten note attached to it. The note was not signed, but one sentence stood out immediately. It suggested that I had made a decision after my husband's death that benefited me and harmed Michael. I read the sentence again, then a third time. The accusation was completely false. Yet suddenly I understood something important. Somewhere along the way, someone had created a version of the past that never happened. And somehow, my son had come to believe it. For the next week, I could think about little else. The document remained folded on my kitchen table beside the stack of letters. Every time I passed it, I felt the same mixture of confusion and disbelief. Someone had convinced Michael that I acted against his interests after his father's death. Someone had created a story so convincing that it survived for more than 20 years. The question was no longer whether a lie existed. The question was who had told it and why. One cold January morning, I drove to the county records office. I was not entirely sure what I expected to find. Perhaps I simply needed proof. Something solid. Something official. The building was quiet, with only a handful of people waiting at the service counter. I requested copies of estate records connected to my late husband's affairs. The clerk disappeared for several minutes before returning with a thick file. I carried it to a table near the window and began reading. The documents confirmed exactly what I remembered. My husband's estate had been divided according to his wishes. The decisions were reviewed by attorneys. The paperwork had been approved by the court. Every step was documented. Every signature was accounted for. There was no evidence that I had taken anything from Michael. No evidence that I had manipulated the process. No evidence supporting the accusation at all. I sat there for nearly an hour reviewing page after page. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. The story someone had told my son was not merely exaggerated. It was false. Completely false. On the drive home, I stopped at a small diner outside town. Snow covered the parking lot. The lunch crowd had not yet arrived. I ordered coffee and sat alone in a booth near the window. That was when another memory surfaced. Years ago, shortly after my husband's funeral, there had been tension within the family. Not with Michael, with others. Relatives had disagreed about financial matters. Certain people believed they deserved more than what the estate provided. At the time, I dismissed the complaints as grief mixed with disappointment. Now I wondered if something else had happened. I wondered whether resentment had quietly transformed into a different story over the years. That evening, I returned to the letters. One envelope contained a Christmas card from Michael written during his sophomore year of college. Inside, he thanked me for helping pay an unexpected tuition expense. He called me his biggest supporter. He said he did not know what he would do without me. I read those words several times. They did not match the distance that existed today. They did not match the quiet judgment I often sensed from him now. Somewhere between that letter and the present day, someone had rewritten the past. As darkness settled outside my windows, I found myself staring at an old family photograph. Michael was smiling. I was smiling. We looked like people who trusted each other completely. For the first time, I began to suspect that the lie was much older than I realized. And if I wanted the truth, I would need to look beyond documents and records. I would need to find the person who started the story in the first place. The person I kept thinking about was my husband's older sister, Patricia. She was 81 years old now and living in a retirement community nearly 2 hours away. For most of my life, Patricia had been the unofficial historian of the family. She remembered every birthday, every disagreement, every story that everyone else forgot. If anyone knew where the lie had started, it was probably her. A few days later, I made the drive. The sky was gray. Patches of snow covered the fields along the highway. The entire trip, I rehearsed what I planned to ask. Yet when Patricia opened the door and welcomed me inside, all of my carefully prepared questions seemed to disappear. We spent nearly an hour talking about ordinary things first. Her garden, her grandchildren, the weather. Eventually, she looked at me over the rim of her teacup and said, "You did not drive all this way to discuss winter." I smiled. Then I told her everything. The distance with Michael, the strange remark from Sarah's mother, the letters, the estate documents, the accusation I had discovered. Patricia listened without interrupting. As I spoke, her expression slowly changed. By the time I finished, she was staring quietly at the floor. That silence told me more than words could have. "Patricia," I said softly, "what do you know?" For several moments, she did not answer. Then she sighed heavily. I always wondered if this day would come. My stomach tightened. She stood and walked to a bookshelf in the corner of the room. From the bottom shelf, she removed a small photo album and a worn envelope. When she returned, she placed both items on the table between us. "After your husband died," she began, "there were family members who were angry about the estate." I nodded. That much I already knew. What you do not know is that one of them started telling stories. They claimed you pressured your husband before he passed away. They claimed you influenced decisions that should have belonged to Michael. I stared at her. The accusations sounded absurd. Yet suddenly they explained everything. Patricia opened the envelope and removed several old letters. Some were written by relatives. Others contained handwritten notes discussing family disagreements from years earlier. As I read them, a pattern emerged. The false story had circulated quietly for decades. Not openly, not dramatically, just enough to survive. Just enough to reach the ears of a young man struggling with grief after losing his father. My chest felt heavy. Michael had not created this belief on his own. He had inherited it. Patricia gently placed her hand over mine. "I should have said something years ago," she whispered. "Many of us should have." I looked down at the letters spread across the table. For the first time, I could finally see the shape of the lie. But even more importantly, I could see how it had followed my son through adulthood, quietly shaping the way he viewed me. And now I realized something else. If I wanted Michael to know the truth, I would need more than suspicions. I would need proof strong enough to challenge a story he had believed for most of his life. When I returned home, I spent the next several days organizing everything I had collected. The letters from Patricia, the estate records, the old correspondence from Michael, the notes that revealed how the false story had spread through the family. I covered my dining room table with documents and arranged them in chronological order. The more I studied them, the clearer the timeline became. What started as resentment after my husband's death had slowly evolved into something much larger. Certain relatives repeated assumptions as facts. Speculation became memory. Memory became truth. And somewhere in the middle of that process, my son lost faith in me. One evening, while reviewing the final group of letters Patricia had given me, I discovered something I had overlooked. Tucked between 2 pages was a photocopy of a handwritten letter dated just 6 months after my husband's funeral. My pulse quickened as I read it. The letter had been written by one of the relatives who originally challenged the estate. What caught my attention was not the complaint itself. It was a sentence near the bottom. The writer admitted that there was no evidence I had done anything wrong. They simply believed my husband should have made different decisions. I read the sentence again, then a third time. There it was, in black and white, an admission that the accusations were based on opinion rather than fact. For years, people had repeated a story they knew could not be proven. The discovery felt important, but I still worried it would not be enough. Michael had lived with these beliefs for decades. A single document might not change that. Then my phone rang. It was Patricia. Her voice sounded excited. She told me she had remembered something after our visit. According to her, another family member had kept detailed journals for many years. That person was now 90 years old and living with her daughter in another state. More importantly, Patricia believed those journals contained entries written during the exact period when the estate disputes occurred. 2 weeks later, copies of several journal pages arrived in my mailbox. I sat at the kitchen table and carefully turned each page. The entries were ordinary at first. Family visits, birthdays, holiday gatherings. Then I reached the section covering the months after my husband's passing. My hands began to tremble. The writer described conversations among relatives, names, dates, specific remarks. Several entries directly contradicted the story Michael had apparently been told. One passage stated clearly that I had followed my husband's wishes exactly as written. Another mentioned frustration from family members who hoped for a different outcome. By the time I finished reading, tears filled my eyes. Not because I felt vindicated, because I finally possessed something undeniable. Independent evidence, contemporary records, proof created before anyone knew these events would matter decades later. For the first time since this journey began, I believed the truth might actually have a chance. And as I gathered the documents into a folder, I realized the moment I had been moving toward was finally approaching. Sooner or later, Michael would need to see everything for himself. For nearly a week, the folder remained on my kitchen counter while I gathered the courage to use it. Several times I picked up the phone to call Michael. Several times I put it back down. How do you tell your own child that a belief he has carried for most of his life may not be true? How do you ask someone to question memories that have shaped an entire relationship? Eventually, I realized there would never be a perfect moment. On a cold Saturday afternoon, I called and asked if he could stop by. To my surprise, he agreed. When Michael arrived, he looked tired, older than I remembered. We sat across from each other at the dining room table where I had spent months sorting through the pieces of our family's past. For a few minutes, neither of us said much. Then I placed the folder between us. "There is something I need you to see," I said quietly. Michael frowned. At first, he seemed confused, then cautious. As he opened the folder, I watched his eyes move from one document to another. The estate records, the letters, the journal entries, the statements from relatives, the evidence that contradicted the story he had apparently believed for years. At first, he read quickly, then more slowly. The room grew silent except for the occasional turning of a page. Nearly 30 minutes passed before he finally looked up. The expression on his face was one I had never seen before. Not anger, not disbelief, something closer to uncertainty. "I do not understand," he said. His voice sounded distant. "This is not what I was told." Those words landed harder than I expected. Not because they surprised me, because they confirmed what I had suspected all along. Someone had told him a different version of our family's history. Someone he trusted. I nodded and gently asked who had first discussed the estate with him after his father's death. Michael stared at the documents for a long moment before answering. Several names emerged. Relatives, conversations, small comments made over many years. None of them seemed significant on their own. Yet together they had built a narrative that followed him into adulthood. As the afternoon faded into evening, he continued reading. At one point, he picked up the photocopied letter containing the admission that no evidence had ever existed against me. He read it twice, then a third time. I saw his shoulders slowly sink. For the first time, the certainty he had carried for decades appeared to crack. The hardest moment came when he found one of the old college letters he had written to me himself. He stared at his own handwriting. The gratitude, the affection, the trust. It was as though he were meeting a younger version of himself, a version untouched by years of assumptions. When he finally looked at me again, his eyes were filled with questions, not accusations, questions. And in that moment, I realized the truth was doing something years of silence never could. It was forcing my son to reconsider everything he thought he knew about me. After Michael left that evening, I sat alone at the dining room table for a long time. The folder remained exactly where he had left it. Several pages were slightly out of place, evidence of how carefully he had studied every detail. Outside, snow drifted quietly through the darkness. Inside, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not victory, not satisfaction, relief. For so long, I had carried the weight of a broken relationship without understanding why. Now, at least, the truth had finally entered the room. Over the following weeks, Michael called more often. The conversations were awkward at first. Neither of us knew exactly how to bridge decades of distance. Sometimes we spoke about ordinary things. Work, the weather, the grandchildren. Sometimes long silences filled the spaces between us. Yet even those silences felt different. The suspicion that had once stood between us was no longer invisible. It had been exposed. One afternoon, Michael stopped by unexpectedly. We sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee. After several minutes, he looked down at his hands and quietly apologized. The words were simple. There was no dramatic speech, no attempt to erase the past, just an honest acknowledgement that he had accepted a story without ever asking whether it was true. I listened without interrupting. Then I told him something I had realized during this journey. The greatest loss was not the holidays I spent alone. It was the years we lost to a misunderstanding neither of us created. Michael nodded slowly, his eyes filled with emotion. For the first time in many years, I saw the same young man who once wrote those college letters. The same son who trusted me completely. Trust does not return overnight. Relationships do not heal in a single conversation. But something important had changed. We were finally standing on the same side of the truth. As spring approached, Michael began including me more often in family gatherings. The invitations were not grand gestures. A birthday dinner, a school event for one of the grandchildren, a weekend barbecue, small moments. Yet each one felt meaningful because they were no longer offered out of obligation. They were offered out of understanding. One evening, I found myself sitting beside my grandchildren while they showed me school projects spread across the dining room table. Michael was laughing with Sarah in the next room. For a moment, I simply watched. Not because everything was perfect. Families are rarely perfect. But because the distance that once felt impossible now seemed smaller. Looking back, I understand that the truth did not change what happened years ago. It did not erase the loneliness. It did not give back the holidays that had already passed. What it did was something far more valuable. It gave my son the chance to see me clearly. And it gave me the chance to stop defending myself against a story that was never true. Today, when people ask what happened between Michael and me, I usually smile and keep the answer simple. Families sometimes inherit more than traditions. Sometimes they inherit misunderstandings. The difference is that misunderstandings grow in silence, while truth grows in the light. And after many years, the light finally reached us both.